This whole video is functionally pointless. It's a waste of time and you won't gain anything by watching it. That's pretty much what the Path of Nihility believes, except you stretch it out to encompass the entire universe and existence itself and not some random YouTube video. The supposed followers of the Path of Nihility admire traits such as laziness, exhaustion, and meaningless behaviors, which begs the question, if most of them are lazy and see things as pointless, why would Nihility even have a following? I mean, wouldn't the people and factions that claim to follow it just eventually not care? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about some of the factions that seemingly follow Nihility and explore why they would do so. Before we do that though, if you want to see more Honkai Star content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Now this video will have some minor spoilers related to the story in 2.1 as it relates to the identities of certain characters, so if you don't want to know anything about that, then you've been warned. One thing I want to discuss before we start talking about Nihility's followers is related to its Eon. In the past, I've seen some of you in the comments ask me how this purple blob's name is really meant to be pronounced. Some say X, some say IX, and some call the Eon 9 as the IX is the Roman numeral for the number 9. Well, as it happens, in 2.1, Acheron actually says its name and she pronounces it as IX, at least in the English version she does. So moving forward, I'll be referring to the Eon of Nihility as IX. Now the Path of Nihility is led by the amorphous ball of despair IX. What's interesting about this path is that while the term nihility often refers to nothingness, emptiness, or a lack of meaning, most that follow the path behave in a manner that seems to be more synonymous with apathy. The reason this happens is because the Eon of Nihility has reasoned or realized that there is no meaning or higher purpose to life itself, rendering everything you do or gain in life functionally pointless. The result of this revelation is why most of its followers are apathetic to anything and everything around them. That said, Nihility seems to have a whole other aspect to itself that goes beyond this, and apathy just seems to be the natural response to those mortals afflicted by Nihility. Acheron alludes to Nihility being a far more fundamental and primordial force in the universe, but I'll reserve that discussion for another video. IX appears as a giant blob of purple matter and seems to be almost gaseous in nature. We don't know if it has any tangible form outside its protruding head and its two beady eyes, but it sort of reminds me of a sentient nebula floating around in the cosmos. There is very little we know about IX, likely because it's damn near impossible to study it or even get close to it. If one enters its range of influence, any mortal creature and even supposedly some eons will fall into a deep despair. One of the members of the Doctors of Chaos mentions that even the mere gaze of the Eon has the ability to cause mortals to lose all reason and thought. Even Herta, a Genius Society member, explicitly forbids the main character from approaching IX in the simulated universe, given how dangerous the effects of doing so is. What makes this even more frightening is that, according to Acheron, the influence of this particular Eon extends itself to nearly every corner of the universe, and their reach is unlike that of other Eons. So suffice to say, very little is known about it, mostly because no one can functionally get near it, let alone talk to it. But it raises an interesting question. If the Eon is so dangerous and the path itself stands for meaninglessness and nothingness, who in their right mind would want to follow this path? Well, as it turns out, the Doctors of Chaos, one of the followers of Nihility, actually provides a rather interesting explanation behind this. You see, they claim that whenever a mortal being starts to realize that existence itself amounts to nothing and then starts using this as their guiding principle in life, they begin to tread on the path of Nihility. Eventually, when they receive the gaze of IX, one of two things will happen. Either the organism begins to devolve and truly becomes nothing, which turns them into the self-annihilators, or they become captivated by the magnificence of IX itself and become a Doctor of Chaos. Now, whether or not IX actually casts its gaze on those that tread its path is an unconfirmed occurrence. On one hand, the Doctors of Chaos claim that this is indeed possible, as they themselves have experienced it. But on the other hand, Acheron mentions that IX doesn't really care about its followers, and true to its nature, does not cast its gaze to any single person. So as of the current story, it seems that there are conflicting points about this very fact, and perhaps could be related to how each faction perceives the Aeon. But again, we are here to talk about the faction, so let's start off with the Doctors of Chaos first. As I've mentioned, the Doctors of Chaos are those that initially realize the meaninglessness of existence, but have done a complete 180 the minute IX supposedly gazed upon them. Instead of further diving into despair, upon being noticed by sentient Depression Senpai, the perceived worthlessness of life they started off with became, in itself, meaningless. It sort of inspired them to revolt against this meaninglessness. At least that's what the databank in the Astral Express claims. While not mentioned, I personally think that when they saw IX in its entirety, they likely came to the irrefutable conclusion that if something as magnificent as an Aeon like IX can exist, then existence must inherently have meaning. This is why their main creed or mission, which they consider a world-saving one, is to convince IX that its existence does indeed have purpose and meaning. The Doctors of Chaos are functionally living in a paradox. Their sense of meaninglessness dissipated when they gazed upon nothingness itself, and their mission is to save something that is unsavable. Why they are doing this is really anyone's guess. Perhaps they really do think they are saving the universe, or maybe it's a gesture of goodwill, returning the favor to IX who, according to them, made the group realize that life isn't meaningless after all. Perhaps they're also probably doing this because simply they think that they might lose IX if it ever got any more depressed. And if they were to lose their only reason for living, then maybe they might end up on that dark road of despair once more. By their own admission though, the Doctors of Chaos only really honor existence and nothing more. They are not trying to avoid death or glorify life, so maybe they aren't as complicated as I've made them seem, and they are just a group that is happy to just live in the moment. If, however, you don't see the value of existence when you fall within the influence of nihility, instead of becoming a Doctor of Chaos, you then become what's referred to as a self-annihilator, the second faction we'll be talking about. Now, most factions that follow the Aeons are often a conglomeration of like-minded people who come together to either venerate their gods or achieve a particular goal in the name of said god. The self-annihilators are, truth be told, not really a faction in the traditional sense. The group is more or less a categorization for a specific type of people afflicted by IX's influence, rather than a group of people that have come together of their own volition. In fact, the way they are spoken about in the lore makes them more akin to a similar category of people rather than a group. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that if an individual were to step within the boundaries of IX's influence, they would ultimately fall into a deep despair. In truth, however, it's far worse than that. Upon entering within IX's domain, the first thing that leaves each individual is their purpose and will to live. This loss is so significant that it then inflicts upon them physical changes. Existential properties such as their corporeal form, mental cognition, and even personal memories all slowly but surely fade away. It's different for each person and likely dependent on how long they were exposed to IX itself. Some have their skin and body begin to rot and decay with scars appearing all over them. Some have their internal systems disrupted and cease to function, while others become functionally numb, unable to differentiate between pain and pleasure. It is almost as if the body itself has lost its will to live, given the realization of the meaninglessness of life. It is a slow and numbing process as each self-annihilator devolves into functionally nothingness, as their body and mind slowly fail. Acheron, who has been confirmed to be a self-annihilator, is a good example of this, with the most prominent feature being her constant loss of memory, and even having lost much of her sense of taste as well. Throughout the story, she seems to be treading the line between existence and nothingness, being physically there but just on the precipice of being nothing as well. Much like their Eon, it's speculated that all self-annihilators will eventually become shadows themselves, and are often theorized to be extensions of the god of nihility and the path. Some self-annihilators, however, try to push against this rather depressing fate and choose to fight against whatever it is that's happened to them. Those who choose this direction may end up working with the Doctors of Chaos and vow to cure those who are afflicted with the same maladies they are, while others may choose to operate individually. It's unclear how they are able to fight against Nihility, though the sealing waxes created by the Doctors of Chaos are said to be able to resist the effects of Nihility to some degree, and others like acheron have their own means against it. For many others, exposure to IX is functionally akin to a death sentence, and only those with the strongest wills or unnatural abilities can actually fight the tide of despair. Among those that do retain some of their mental coherency, there is a saying they share amongst them. They believe that the universe truly has no purpose, and humans are nothing in the eyes of the eons. If the aeons truly stand above all other life forms and rule supreme, why would they care about the everyday concern of mortals? This likely stems from them having experienced the cruelty of existence and the despair that the shadows of IX cast upon the mortal world. It's fundamentally the same question that Aventurine asks when he meets Acheron. It's a very dejected view on existence and might explain or give a bit of insight into why the self-annihilators undergo the physical changes that they do. If it wasn't clear by this point, meeting IX is not something you would want, unless you have a godly amount of positivity, otherwise you may risk becoming much like the self-annihilators. Obviously, this faction will have a lot to do with Acheron, and rest assured, I'll have a separate video discussing her past and her role as a self-annihilator. Now, there is one more faction that is said to be related to Nihility, but whether it really exists or not is really up for debate. There is a school of thought that claims that existence in itself is a prison. Every perception of reality is constrained within the things that make up said reality. Your body, mind, and the individual building blocks that make up reality like matter and even concepts like order are meant to constrain you and chain you to existence. On the opposite side of this is true nihility and entropy. These two concepts exist as balancing forces that make up the complete universe. You cannot have one without the other. It is in this true nihility, the void itself, that the faction calling itself the device IX is said to reside. They cannot be perceived by the material world, but if one peers into the abyss long enough, a dark, overflowing energy can be felt pulling you across the interstice of these two conceptual realms. Many legends exist regarding this faction, but almost none of it can be confirmed. We don't even know of a single member. From the description given in the Doctor's Robe Curio, which once belonged to Dr. Primitive, it's mentioned that the device IX operates the dark web, where much like our own dark web, a bunch of shady stuff happens like illegal transactions. But even this isn't a confirmed extension of this so-called faction, as those operating the dark web may just be using the reputation of the Nihility as a way to create intrigue or interest. So functionally, we don't know who makes up their membership, where their base of operations is, nor what their goals even are. That said, Acheron mentions that the end of her journey will ultimately take her to Nihility's end, which in the text refers to device IX. This might hint that they do indeed exist, or perhaps is instead a location one ultimately ends up in. A black hole is nothing more than a singular point of concentrated gravity, and perhaps that is exactly what the device IX is. But since we don't know any more than that, this faction will have to remain a mystery until maybe much later in the story. That brings this video to an end. While Nihility seems pretty straightforward, the lore recently revealed in 2.1 may indicate that there are far more fearsome paths than we initially assumed. The message ingrained in Nihility is that there is no point, and it's all a waste of time. But it could also mean the ultimate end of everything, and therein lies IX's true influence. Whether Nanook wins or Terminus succeeds in getting its ending, or any of the other eons get their way, the final point of existence may indeed be nothingness. So in truth, whoever wins, so does Nihility. And that's pretty scary. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are the factions here on point with Nihility, or should the path have better factions? Which one is the most interesting? If you enjoyed watching the video, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.